This is not poetry or prose, it's a story, isn't it? Well, it's a small story. It's called Armchair. Can you hear the wood pigeon outside the window? Beautiful. He'd been sat down for a long time. He'd always had periods of sitting down for a long time, but this was different. He'd been sat in the armchair for days now. Was it days? It seemed like that. His body appeared to be submerged into the armchair, like he was becoming part of it, or even becoming it. The support he'd had from the armchair and life in general had waned, diminished, weakened, and slowly, but with great certainty, gone. His own situation was a microcosm of what was happening in society across the country. Division, public service cuts, apathy were all things that were affecting him and he'd become part of. He didn't know what to do, or what he could do, what was possible, or what was for the best. He had no ideas. He had ideas of what could be for the best, but sadly for him and them, there were significant and sufficient numbers of others who could only see one way. Same as we have, but getting slightly worse each year. But the slightly worse part being just small enough to keep people from looking beyond the apparently only way. He felt the skin of the armchair, brutally cut from some poor creature which itself had been part of the one way and was now a tribute to itself, as its skin and his slowly merged into the same thing as the days or months passed by. Nobody came round anymore. Nobody had done for a long time, so silence, darkness and lethargy had become the newer associates. He tried to move, but not that hard. He was comfortable in his new body. His bodily functions had reconfigured themselves so that drink or food were now unnecessary. He had evolved into a new hybrid species, a species that knew where it stood in the world, where its place was. A sturdy, non-threatening species that kept to itself, but one that no longer had to be grateful. There was nothing to be grateful for now. There was nothing left to share out. There was little left to do. There was little left to hope for. All possible sparks of hope, of decency, of community had been banished a few decades earlier, as barely a handful of people had anything and owned everything. The will to fight this situation was long gone, and those that had everything had the old and new media as their possessions. So even if things seemed bad, there was always some product to buy and somebody else to blame. He recognised the situation from where he sat, and now stood, of course. There was no escape from the advertising. There was no chance to change, only to evolve in the remaining time left. His arm flesh seeped into the armrests, and skeletal fragments merged with structural wood. The process continued for several days. The smell of the armchair and surroundings became sweet and sickly, and soon enough there was no distinction between him and the armchair. A new superhero had been created, but there would be no great battles with the planet destroyers. This superhero would only have one major strength, and that was the strength of meek acceptance. Outside, the temperature had risen to temperatures never seen in this part of the world before, and the armchair would very soon evolve into another species entirely, as the egos of the handful took over what little rationality remained, and the inevitability of planetary destruction was sped up, much to the relief of the planet itself. These parasites that had mined so much of her beauty had done themselves in a few decades earlier than expected. Such was their stupidity. The armchair began to burn, melt, and then turn to plasma. It was over at last. He was now content to have reached his final state.